Hello, I'm Dr. Andrew Bennett, the Reverend Dr. Andrew Bennett, and thank you for joining us on this occasion of the Cardus 25 celebrations. We're celebrating 25 years since the establishment of Cardus, and one of the ways we're celebrating is through this webinar series. So thank you for being with us today. I'm the Director of Faith Community Engagement at Cardus, and that means that I'm engaged in speaking with Canadian faith leaders, predominantly Christian leaders across the country, engaging them in our work, and also working to help lead our program of public theology at Cardus, including through our Communio program for Christian young professionals. But today I'm here to interview a friend of mine, Dr. James Orr, and we are going to be discussing the nature of pluralism and whether Christians can fully participate in 21st century pluralism. Dr. James Orr is a associate professor of the philosophy of religion in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge in the UK. He is a noted conservative commentator. He is also the director of UK programming for the Trinity Forums Europe, and also chairman of the Edmund Burke Society in the United Kingdom. So, James, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So this question of pluralism is one that sort of manages to poke its head up every once in a while, especially in the context of how we engage with it as Christians and what is the nature of a pluralist society. So I want to maybe just start off our conversation today with just some definitions. So how would you define pluralism generally? And then secondarily, how might 21st century Western pluralism, as we might experience it, and we do experience it in Canada and the United Kingdom, how is that a distinct form of pluralism, and maybe what distinguishes it from some earlier expressions?
Well, in many ways, you can say that the great distinction between the one and the many, between monism and pluralism, goes right back to the dawn of thought. Not only in Western thought, but in Eastern thought. You can say in Eastern thought that Vedantic traditions are this sort of constant push and pull between the sense that reality is ultimately one and reality is ultimately atomistic or plural. You see this in the Western traditions, of course, figures like Parmenides, great philosophers of unity, of oneness, undifferentiated oneness, and that appearances of plurality are simply really illusions, or simply multiple manifestations of a single underlying reality. On the other hand, you have thinkers like Heraclitus or Empedocles, or who would the others be? Democritus, for example, who are atomistic philosophers, and they think of reality as ultimately plural. So, in many ways, it's the sort of it's a kind of organizing axis for the whole of the history of Western metaphysics. And I'm not actually sure, when does the language of pluralism emerge in the contemporary context? Well, first of all, it's not a political term. It's still a philosophical one. It's still in the realm of metaphysics. I think probably it's William James, his work in 1909, I think something like On the Pluralistic Universe, and his idea, this is sort of the blooming, buzzing confusion, that famous phrase, this idea that reality is ultimately plural and kind of fragmented, and we can't kind of contain it all. We can't sort of encompass it all, both epistemologically in terms of our cognitive capacities, but also even if we had total clarity in terms of our cognitive access to the world, we would see that the world itself is fragmented and disparate. Now, how does this all connect to politics, you might well ask? Well, as so often, metaphysics is connected. Politics is always downstream of metaphysics in some way. And I think what's animating William James and the sort of pluralist thinkers that emerge roughly contemporaneous with him, I'm thinking of figures like John Neville Figgis or Harold Lasky, the so-called English Guild pluralists. They're really reacting against the political monism of Hegelian thinkers and the British Hegelian school that again sees a reality in the state. In, of course, Hegel's philosophy of right in the 1820s is really this sort of unfurling or the final culmination of his grand metaphysical work that he starts in 1807 with the Phenomenology of Spirit. And there, basically, the idea is that the family and other institutions, social institutions, and the state kind of are all sort of emerging into a solidified unity. And the early political pluralists, the guild pluralists, particularly in England and Scotland, are, as it were, resisting that. There's a sense that there's something tyrannical and totalitarian about that sort of Hegelian metaphysics of the state. And so there's a kind of resistance to that, and then there's a kind of recovery of the medieval guild traditions, in the case of Figgis and Lasky and people like Frederick Maitland, the great historian of English law. And so that's the kind of current that we see, broadly speaking, in Britain, but it also exports itself very quickly to the Anglosphere more generally. And so the idea here is certainly, this comes with people like Otto von Guericke and the great German political theorist, adapted by Maitland into the Anglophone context, which is this idea of a kind of a group personality. It's a group has more than just a fictive legal personality. They're actually kind of living, organic entities within society. And these are plural, and these are decentralized, and that this is recognizing these sort of the organic nature of these sort of collective identities is important, is something to be celebrated, in particular because it provides a check against the overarching and overweening tendencies of the emerging centralized industrial state that is beginning really to get going in the late 19th century. So that is sort of early sort of 20th century context of pluralism. And in many ways, if you think of somebody like John Neville Figgis, that doctrine of pluralism is absolutely rooted in Augustinian pluralism. Book 19 of The City of God, of course, there's famous passages where, Augustine says we must be agnostic about the distinction between the elect and the non-elect, the unelect, and that this imposes a kind of, political quietism of sorts, a kind of humility in the way we deal with our fellow brothers and sisters. Now, what we've seen more recently in debates about pluralism is actually a very, very different kind of thing. Pluralism, this doctrine of pluralism, has been really secularized and has been uprooted and deracinated from its Augustinian, its medieval, and its late 19th century sort of anti-Hegelian roots. And we can come to talk about that in a bit, if you like.
So that early 20th century conception of pluralism that you've just sort of elaborated upon, to me sounds like it has maybe a common root or a commonality with a lot of what we find in Catholic social teaching, around the whole idea of subsidiarity, solidarity, but then also maybe in the Kuyperian sort of neo-Calvinist tradition of sphere sovereignty, and that you have various sort of spheres within society that have to be connected with one another. So that, in that sense, a pluralism. And that there isn't sort of this monistic state that can sort of dictate how those important communities, those little battalions, how they all sort of kind of come together. Would you say that's a fair characterization of that early 20th century pluralism?
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. And I didn't mean to be sort of chauvinistic and Anglo-centric in the way I framed my understanding of pluralism. But what I would say is that, if you think of that great encyclical by Leo XIII of 1891 and Rerum Novarum, and if you think of Abraham Kuyper and the emergence of the Dutch neo-Calvinists and their idea of sphere sovereignty, it's happening at roughly the same time. Even though they are operating, you couldn't get more sort of parallel, disconnected traditions of political theology than those. And yet, Figgis and Guericke and Leo XIII and Kuyper and the other Dutch neo-Calvinists, they are responding to a common, to a shared sort of sense, a common sense that the state is, as it were, suffocating group identity, the sort of you might say that the body politic, or those intermediating institutions that were so constitutive of medieval society up really into the industrial period and into the Enlightenment. But I'd also say something else. It's not just that pluralism provides this sort of mediating buffer against the state. It also provides a means of connecting us to one another in certain non-negotiable ways. In particular, in other words, it's an antidote not only to the overweening power of a kind of Hegelian state, but it's also an antidote to the atomism of liberal individualism, of pure sheer autonomy, to the kind of liberal myth that we are simply born into the world, free to repudiate all unchosen obligations, that we can exist without being connected to one another in some way. So I think Leo XIII sees that. I think Abraham Kuyper sees that. Figgis sees this, and in a way, it's a sort of shared recognition across denominational boundaries, that somehow we've lost that way of connecting society, of understanding society as this organic living unity made up of multiple groups, multiple guilds, multiple ways of being with one another that are not imposed by the state and are not dissolved by doctrines of kind of assertive liberal autonomy and individualism. Where are we now? Where are we with pluralism today? Why do I think it's something so different? And we use the same words of pluralism as it emerges in the context that Father Andrew and I were discussing in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But what we have now is a use of the word pluralism that captures something very, very different. And pluralism in the secular context of today is very, very different. Now, what was understood by Figgis and by Leo XIII and by Abraham Kuyper and so on was that pluralism operated within a broadly shared conception of mutual flourishing and the common good. It didn't need to be stated, for example, by Leo XIII or Abraham Kuyper or John Neville Figgis, that this pluralism of guilds, of groups, of free associations, of free citizens and subjects, operated within a broadly, certainly culturally unified, often ethnically unified, certainly normatively and religiously unified a group of people. And what we have, and so to some extent, the enabling conditions of pluralism was a kind of unreflective unity of a people, of a single people, or of a single set of peoples in the case of Britain, and obviously there'd be kind of tensions there, but there was, broadly speaking, we're talking about high trust, homogenous, united societies where the sort of acids of liberal individualism and aggressive programmatic secularism hadn't really begun to trickle through society. Now, what we have now with the doctrines of John Rawls, for example, who says that, yes, it's important for competing conceptions of the good to be, as it were, neutralized. We should be, we should have a kind of agnosticism towards them in order to be able to operate within the pluralist public square of the secular liberal state. This is very, very different, because there simply is no shared common horizon. That's not permitted. One has to maintain a principled agnosticism towards that for fear of civil conflict, or the liberal myth is that we need to keep a lid on violence and conflict between those who follow competing conceptions of the good. And when the truth is that what really raises the risk of that kind of violence, in my view, is opening up the moral community at scale and speed to large numbers of people who who operate in radically different moral universes and operate on the basis of radically different moral assumptions. Mm-hmm. We're certainly seeing the effects of this here in Britain. And so, the doctrine of pluralism has shifted from what I think was quite a healthy way of understanding mechanisms for mediating between liberal atomism on the one hand and an overreaching state on the other, into a kind of mechanism for policing dissent and policing the peace of an increasingly low trust and fragmented multicultural society.
Well, I think that raises obviously a very important question about how, Christians are participating in this evolution in pluralism that has taken place that you've just been describing. So is Christian participation in pluralist Western societies limited now? And if so, who is limiting it? Is it the state? Is it the culture generally? Is it we as Christians ourselves? Have we sort of bought into this atomization and we've sort of taking refuge in the comfortable pew, even where we just don't speak in a way that seeks to generate maybe that earlier conception of pluralism, or is it just too late?
Mm. Well, the answer to that question is going to vary quite significantly from country to country. In my own country, we have this unusual situation. Of course, we have an established church, and we have had since the Act of Supremacy in the early 16th century. And so formally, our sovereign is obviously Supreme Governor of the Church of England. We have 27 Lords Spiritual in the House of Lords who maintain that sort of ancient link of the episcopate to the monarch. And really, in many ways, it's the episcopacy that constitutes the nation way back in 1200 years ago or so. How is that really working out for us? Well, you could say that there is actually, I think, quite significant participation by Christians in the public square in England. I noted that in the last Parliament, this was a Conservative Tory government, 2019 to 2024, the voting record of the 27 bishops in the upper house was 95% against the Conservative government, which amusingly is they voted against the government even more often than the Labour Party, the opposition party itself. My friend Ed West, a wonderful Catholic historian here and lives in London, has this, likes to call England the world's only left-wing theocracy. And that I think is a slight exaggeration.
Yeah.
But I do note that, for example, the Archbishop of York, we don't have an Archbishop of Canterbury. The chair of St. Augustine is empty at the moment, and actually the church is doing rather well despite that, or perhaps, dare I say, because of it. But the Archbishop of York has decided to step in last week and condemned a speech by Nigel Farage, in which Nigel Farage said that the speed and scale of the experiment in mass immigration over the last 4 or 5 years in Britain, where 1 in 27 Brits arrived, walking around Britain at the moment, arrived in the last 4 or 5 years. This is more than has arrived in the first 1,200 years of our history, with no attempt to integrate them, no attempt to try to make sense of what kind of impact this will have on our social cohesion and levels of trust and a sense of common purpose. This was condemned by the Archbishop of York as quasi, I can't quite remember the language, but this was quasi-fascist, to want to have for a government to have strong borders and to be able to decide who gets to be a member of the part of our national family, and who gets to be, as it were, returned to their countries of origin because of sort of plain ban intent. This was immediately condemned and demonized as this is a position, by the way, that's held by over 60% of the British population now. This was condemned as being Oswald Mosley type instincts. But when it came to things like the mass child sexual exploitation of girls up and down the country over the last 20, 30 years, or when it comes to some very, very egregious scandals and crimes, we've had complete silence from the church. So on the one hand, we do have quite significant intervention by church leaders, which is completely out in public discourse, but it tends to be very, very one-sided. And it tends to, I think, demonize, reasonable conservative Christian positions on the other end of the argument that tend to be held by a majority of those in the pew.
Well, certainly, I mean, it's very rare in church history where the church being fused with the state has been good for the church. Inevitably, it's not so bad for the state, but the church typically doesn't benefit. So that's maybe an interesting sort of path we can go down around this whole idea of an official presence of faith within the public square, such as the Church of England or the Church of Scotland. And when does that become an impediment to the advancing of the gospel or the advancing of corporal works of mercy, whatever it might be, whereby you become sort of tied to the state in such a way that you become somewhat indistinguishable from it. And we can go back certainly to the Oxford movement. I've been doing a lot of work on Newman recently, and of course that's what they were critiquing. They were critiquing this sort of stale Christianity that had sort of settled into early Victorian England. So when we're talking about certainly Cardus, we speak a lot about the importance of public faith and of public faith in the debate of the country. But there's a very different type of public faith that operates in this kind of circumstance in the UK, whereas in Canada, we don't have an established church. And so churches certainly do get marginalized in various ways, but there is perhaps a greater freedom. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that dynamic. Do you feel that the Church of England is perhaps less free to be able to engage in these types of debates given its status?
Yes, I think that's certainly true. I mean, it's something I deeply regret in the sense that I think, at its best, the Church of England could be a countercultural prophetic witness to a nation that is increasingly embracing not just secular positions, but frankly heretical positions that are just plainly antithetical to any Christian, to the Christian moral life as it's been broadly understood across all denominations for millennia. I noticed, I think particularly over COVID and the lockdown, I was struck by the number of people writing to me. I teach philosophy of religion here in Cambridge, so one of the great perks of the job is that people write to me out of the blue, wanting to talk to me about faith and the ultimate questions. And I noticed a real uptick in that from sort of March 2020 onwards, over this sort of, in the wake of this incredibly sort of existentially disorienting process for many, many people. And many people developed a kind of, I suppose, a skepticism and a deep sort of collapse of a widespread collapse of trust in institutional authority for all sorts of reasons, whether they were good reasons or not or less good reasons. But this somehow drove them to thinking much more deeply about the eternal things. And I remember my great frustration, and I would, there's a limit to what I can do. I don't have your pastoral gifts, Father Andrew, but I would give them certain things to read, and I would point them in a certain direction, and I would say, well, find a church, find a church. And the response would be, but I can't. They won't open their doors. And I feel the Archbishop of Canterbury is celebrating communion at his breakfast table in Lambeth Palace, and even though the government offered the Church of England certain accommodating measures that would have made it possible to continue services, they actually they said no, we're going to double down on this, and we want to kind of gold-plated regulations for us too. So that's one example, I think, of the way in which, and there are many others like it, but which are probably would touch on more neuralgic questions around sexuality and gender but also climate and race, empire and history and heritage and decolonization and reparations. For example, the Church of England, this is a highly contentious debate, reparations for historic injustices about which reasonable Christians can and do and should be able to disagree freely. The Church of England has effectively taken one highly contentious side in that debate, and as it's been shutting parishes up and down the country with its assets of £11 billion sitting at BlackRock, it has decided to set aside £100 million and allocate that to reparations for historic injustices, even though there's enormous confusion about the methodology of how one goes about securing justice for victims downstream of wrongs that were committed 200 years ago, how one deprives the descendants of the perpetrators who are somehow morally causally connected to the original perpetrators and so on. I mean, it's a complete mess, and yet they're going full steam ahead. £100 million. I mean, what that would do to parishes, reviving the parish system, our ancient parish system up and down the country, and at a time when the country badly needs it. We're going through a cost of living crisis. We're going through a crisis of breakdown in public services and in social services and health, education, and so on. And the church, and I can't remember a time when the country has needed what the church and the wonderful sort of parochial system that is the Church of England has been historically so able to deliver. But and it's not even that the coffers are empty; they're being spent on these madcap, highly contentious, politicized schemes.
Well, you raised a really, I think, important trend, maybe highlighted by those people that are writing to you asking, where can I go? Where can I find, these answers? That eternal search for meaning, that eternal quest for universal objective truth that certainly the church has been there to offer in the gospel. And certainly we see it here in Canada as well. We are a highly secularized, secularist society, as is the UK. And what I've noticed in my own work is how many, and we see this at Cardus as well through our various programs that we have for young adults, is this desire for something that is stable, something that is authentic, something that is not about them, but rather something that is greater than them, that they're looking for, and this desire for belonging to a tradition that is something that can be penetrated very, very deeply. And to do so, you have to be bounded. You can't, of course, this tautology that the goal of freedom is to be free. Well, no, the goal of freedom is to pursue the good in that sort of Aristotelian sense. But if you're not bounded, you can't do that. And so, what are you seeing also in terms of those types of trends in the UK? Certainly,
Mm.
there's you're seeing it in probably a number of the circles that you're in, whether it's Trinity Forums or the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, these desires, especially amongst young adults, for meaning.
Mm.
And does pluralism, as we now have it, constrain that quest, would
Mm.
you say?
Mm. Well, it's a great question. And, the first thing to say is to slightly vary that famous line of Etienne Gilson, who spent many, many fruitful and formative years in Canada.
Mm.
Christianity always buries its undertakers. It was Chesterton's line, 5 times in history, Christianity went to the dogs, and every time it was the dog that died. So, I'm not pessimistic. In fact, if anything, I'm quite optimistic, because in that very period, since 2020, I saw the other day that belief in God, now, these survey questions are always a little bit nebulous, and religious adherence is notoriously hard to measure, and so on and so forth. Yes. However, among 18 to 35-year-olds in the United Kingdom over the last 5 years, belief in God has tripled. Tripled. Bible sales have gone up by 87%. We're seeing similar sort of phenomena in the United States, and that's at the sort of, as it were, the demographic level. But also, I think you and I have seen friends of ours, people in ARC circles, for example, who so actually indeed on the ARC stage in October 2023. Do you remember that extraordinarily moving public confession by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the writer and human rights activist, formerly one of the sort of outriders of the new atheist movement, coming to faith? Indeed, I had the privilege of attending her christening in a lovely little church in Oxfordshire in September of was it September September last year, I think it was. And along with Sir Neil Ferguson, a great one of our great historians, and both their children. It was a family christening, an incredibly moving thing to witness. And Neil was Glaswegian atheist. He was and his 90-year-old mother was there, and she wasn't at all happy about it. But he really came for the sort of the tradition of Adam Smith and David Hume and that great sort of spirit of Scottish Enlightenment skepticism, and yet there he was. And so you're seeing it sort of both at the ground level, and curiously, who would have thought 20 years on from the high noon of the new atheism, we're seeing actually the new atheists themselves, those that are still with us, expressing varying degrees of regret, and many of their outriders explicitly coming to faith. And so there's sort of, I don't want to overstate this,
Yes,
but it is striking the intellectual credibility and the existential credibility that Christianity now has. And I wonder if there's something to do with a sort of C.S. Lewis says at one point that in response to charges that England was becoming pagan, he said, "Well, would that we were," because a pagan nation would be far easier to convert than a thoroughly secular nation that had self-consciously repudiated Christianity. And I wonder if there's something about that we're emerging into a state of a kind of radical pluralism where we can't really remember what it is that the pluralism came out of, and that Christianity is something that it is tam antiqua, tam nova. It's ever ancient and it's ever new. but it feels new now to many people, just
Mhm.
because, most of my students, the students who will be starting my lectures in 2 weeks' time, let's have a think. They would have been born in 2007. 2007. Two
Yeah.
years after the publication of The God Delusion. They have no idea who Richard Dawkins is, most of them.
Mhm.
But they are in a world of dislocation, of socioeconomic marginalization. Even Cambridge graduates now struggling to get jobs, struggling to get on the housing ladder, searching for meaning. And of course, there's this extraordinary new digital public square. And it's much harder to make a digital public square a Rawlsian digital public square than it was when Theory of Justice was published in 1971. The standard sort of liberal mechanisms for gatekeeping, secularity, and policing and enforcing neutrality have been dissolved by the internet. Now,
Mhm.
for the most part, conservatives are, I think, rightly worried about the liquefying power of technology. But I think, it has also brought extraordinary benefits when you can have, the finest. My students in Cambridge can listen to the finest preacher in Vancouver with the click of a button.
Well, it is striking, and what really strikes me is these young adults that I know that probably are similar to those you're engaging. Those ancient forms that are again eternally new, they enter into them. Let's say the liturgy, for example. And we had one young adult at our parish, beautiful Byzantine liturgy every Sunday. And I could see he'd been there for about a year and a half, and he was really being enriched by the liturgy. And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "Well, at university, we're told that we can do anything. We can save the world. We can do whatever we want to do. We can be whatever we want to be. But I realize in the liturgy that it's not about me, and I'm free. I'm free in the liturgy." And so you have these especially these young adults and others like Ian Hirsiali and Neil Ferguson and so forth who are being drawn into this this kind of cloud of just witness and a beauty of sort of perceiving the kingdom, right? They see that, but they're trying to negotiate or just trying to navigate through that. But I think one of the challenges they face, especially young adults, is that once they're there, they don't then know how to go back out into the world that they have kind of left in a sense to engage it. So what are some of those forms of engagement that Christians can practice to be present, in the world and to maybe they can't fully convert the pluralism that we have, but they can certainly begin to help maybe some of the edges to fray a little bit more. So, what kind of helps them to engage in that form of engagement that they need to do? And obviously,
Mm.
there's a formational aspect to that. They need to be disciplined and to be formed and so forth. But for all of us as Christians, how can we then, kind of go back out into the world and to re-engage in what we might call, the liturgy after the liturgy?
Mm. Well, it's a very interesting question, and I don't think I have a very good answer to it. But I do have an observation, and that is that in all the various political work that I've been involved in the last 5 or 6 years, and of various kinds, whether it's freedom of speech, academic freedom, bioethics, increasingly now questions around energy, immigration, belonging, national unity, and so on. I do notice that there are disproportionately many Christians in the trenches with me relative to their numbers in the country at large, and that there are disproportionately many, shall we say, traditional Christians, and by that I mean not Orthodox Christians, because most of them will tend to be Orthodox, small O Orthodox in their persuasion, in the various sort of battles, at least on my side of the various battles that we've been fighting on, but tend to be drawn. There are remarkably few evangelicals I've noticed, and this is not a criticism of evangelicals. And indeed, I came to faith through the charismatic evangelical church. But my impression is that there are disproportionately many Catholics or high church Anglicans who are sort of most engaged or most sort of fired up about these questions, most organized. I mean, my family went on the March for Life here in London on Saturday. I was at the Reform conference in Birmingham and I couldn't join them. But I mean, I looked at the list of bishops and priests who were officiating at the services that began the sort of wonderful March for Life, and I think could see one Anglican bishop, the bishop, the bless him, Martin Warner, the Bishop of Chichester. Maybe I'd have to have another look, but I could only see one. In the national church, I could see almost no investment at all in this vital issue of our time that should unite all Christians. It was overwhelmingly the Catholic and Orthodox communities who were most sort of engaged in this vital question. Now, what's the connection there to traditional sort of the liturgical universe? Well, I think it's fairly self-evident. I mean, it's not to say that the Church of England has entirely forgotten that liturgical universe, but and there are many churches that still do it and still do it beautifully. We're blessed with the Book of Common Prayer and Anglican liturgy and so on. But my sense is, there's a lot of it here in Cambridge, but it only runs for half the year during term time. It's the services are packed with tourists. Yes, no doubt they are communing with God, but there's a feeling that it's become a little bit more performative, and that there isn't that sort of lively connection between the sort of liturgy, the liturgical universe doesn't spill over beyond the services into the world.
Mm-hmm. I want to sort of move on and talk a little bit more about the politics around this, and I'll begin with a story again. A young fellow at our parish who came up to me one Sunday after church and looked to me and said, "Father Deacon Andrew, are you a monarchist?" And I said, "Well, yes, I am a monarchist." And this fellow, probably 19 years of age or so, he said, very good. I'm also a monarchist. I think all Catholics should be monarchists." And I said, "Well, I tend to agree with you there." So there's this attraction, like you were just saying, James, not only to traditional forms of Christian faith and Christian worship and practice, but also traditional political forms. And you are certainly plugged into that, I would say, maybe a bit of a renaissance in conservatism, and not only in the United Kingdom, but in other parts of the Anglosphere. Very active in the national conservatism movement. You're obviously connected with the Edmund Burke Foundation and so forth. But you have your detractors who think that maybe the National Conservative Movement or the Reform Party are sort of the second coming of the British Union of Fascists, and you already mentioned Sir Oswald Mosley. So how do you respond to those who are very nervous at best and apoplectic at worst about this shift that seems to be taking place in what should be a highly politically pluralist society? How do you respond to this fear that any sort of manifestation of a more traditional sort of conservatism is somehow a threat?
Well, as is, so often the most fruitful course of action in these kinds of, in all debates, really, I return to Augustine and Augustine's great insight that we love what is our own. And that doesn't mean that we don't love other things, but we love most of all what is our own. Everybody is conservative about what they love most. You love something, you will the means, you will the good of the other. The great Aquinas definition of love: to love something is to will its good, and it's not to change it, it's not to disrupt it, it's not to do violence on it, it's to want to treasure it and preserve it. And so, that's how I understand, and I understand that to be not just a theological insight of Augustine's, but actually a profoundly empirical one. I think you can recognize just, the secular atheist is perfectly capable of understanding that these concentric circles of affection that extend to maybe our spouse, to our children, to our parents, to our immediate family, and then to our community, and they radiate out. And then the question is, what is that outermost circle of concentric affection or political affection or loyalty, beyond which our loves can't really be motivated to action anymore? And I think for the time being, that is probably the optimal outermost concentric circle is the nation. There's nothing intrinsic about the post-Westphalian nation state that makes it such. When Aristotle talks about, the sort of optimal size for a flourishing community, he's talking about the polis, which ranged from a city of up to 30 to 100,000 people, really at most. But that's the basic idea, and it's not nationalism. It's not a kind of fetishizing of the nation that Mosley was guilty of over and above everything else. It's actually to say that the nation is probably the weakest form of concrete loyalty. It's the outermost form of concrete loyalty, but it needs to be there. One needs to have that sort of shared sense of common endeavor if we're going to have the appetite to, as it were, here in Britain, to pay marginal tax rates of 60% to millions and millions of strangers. We don't, generally speaking, we might grumble a bit, but we do that because we feel that we are in this together. And I think what the great sort of national conservative critique of liberalism as this kind of rootless, cosmopolitan, deracinated sense of a kind of abstract humanity that doesn't really exist, is that it sort of dissolves that deep human instinct that we love what is our own, and that we are not really, we're not gifted with the capacity that God has to love absolutely everybody without any partiality. And we are respecters of persons, as it were, in the act sense. And so the thought there is that sort of empirical recognition of what it is that motivates us, our loves, our feelings, our affections, and Hume's right about that. That's the main driver of human behavior in so many ways. Whether you want to kind of put an Augustinian or do a Morris spin on that, or whether you want to simply apply a Darwinian analysis, which simply says that we've evolved over millennia in sort of small bands, and that's the realist perception of how we operate, and political structures and ideas and should be built around that. And to go back to your pluralism point, if you think back to the pluralism of a Lasky or a Figgis or a Maitland, I think they too understood this. It's not for nothing that Figgis wrote extensively about Augustine and about the city of God. The pluralist kind of recognizes that this is how human beings evolve, that they connected to each other. They don't need the state to tell them how to be connected. And they recognize the myth of a sort of atomistic individualism. And so they want there to be political space, as it were, civic space, for these sort of bonds of affection to be formed, for the little platoons to be sort of bonded together within an overarching sense of common endeavor and common identity, unlike that sort of common endeavor and common identity that liberal multiculturalism has done so much to dissolve.
Well, sort of building upon that comment, I want to get into a few questions that we've had submitted to the webinar, and one of them addresses this exact question again. The question is, do you think the effective redefinition of pluralism to be synonymous with multiculturalism, rather than something more complex, was a deliberate shift to encourage the acceptance of all cultures, or was it something more organic?
It's a great question. I tend to apply, I think it's Hanson's razor with these questions that, never attribute to conspiracy that what is better attributed to just to error, and or sort of unreflective, the kind of unreflective emergence of a phenomenon. I think it's very, very rare indeed that there are wizards behind the curtain orchestrating things from the top of Davos or wherever. I don't have that much faith in the competence of human beings or the skill of human beings to orchestrate the world in that way. So I think it's, the most obvious thing to say would be, the shock of the Holocaust, the shock of the Second World War, the shock of the confrontation with the tyranny of Marxist Leninism and the Soviet Union. I think probably, instilled a kind of, collective breakdown of confidence in the Western project and in the universe of Western norms and moral assumptions. And there's so many different factors, I think, sort of dissolving that. So it was an intellectual skepticism that emerged in France and in Germany in particular, and they got exported to the United States and then back and then back over here. Partly questions of economics, both economic dispossession, but also I think just as much massive material prosperity, affluenza, which allowed us to forget the deep things and forget the necessity of being connected to each other in certain non-negotiable ways that seem to underwrite the project of liberal individualism, and that led to that led to sort of a kind of hedonistic skepticism that was just as bad as other forms that it took. And then I think just the sheer fact of demographic change here in England began quite slowly with the Nationality Act in 1948, and broadly speaking, we integrated and accommodated the first waves of post-imperial subjects from what was then West Pakistan and India. And generally speaking, they took root in these islands very well, and in many ways they were more British than the British. But I think the speed and scale of that over the last 25 years has, as it were, inflicted a kind of identity crisis within the nations. It's not clear who we are anymore. It's not clear that we can use the first person plural in as confident a way as we could before 2000. And I think one antidote that we might have developed to try to maintain that sense of the first person plural was not multiculturalism, but its opposite, monoculturalism. If there had been a monoculture, that is to say, a very, very strict commitment to, possibly a slightly silly and twee, jingoistic understanding of Britishness, but one that we broadly, anchored in the monarchy and afternoon tea and cricket and so on, but, but that we all broadly signed up to, that is to say, not a multiculturalism that incentivized demographic silos and mutual mistrust and misunderstanding, then I think we might have been able to do it. I mean, I was reading the Book of Ruth last week. Not a long read, an easy Bible reading. But I was so struck rereading it, and that those wonderful famous lines of Ruth, where you dwell, I will dwell. And where you go, I will go, and your God shall be my God, and your people shall be my people. And it's a wonderful message that, a kind of integration of people from different parts of the world with different loves and perhaps different norms is not impossible, but there's a very high bar. That level of sort of integration it's very, very difficult. And one of the details that struck me is that after she says that, she's still Ruth the Moabite. She never becomes Ruth the Israelite, and that doesn't matter. She's integrated, and she's part of them, and yet she's still, even after that, she's not part of them. And I think that provides a very nice template for how important it is to generate something, a sense of a very sort of a shared universe that needn't efface or erase or dishonor the cultures and identity of guests and friends coming from very different parts of the world, but that it is absolutely essential that there is that deep commitment, that willingness to be integrated deeply and to associate very, very strongly with the host nation.
Well, we have, I think, a lot of people that are following this webinar who have been reading their Taylor, and they're very up to speed. They're very good Canadians reading their Charles Taylor. And one of the questions that they've raised builds upon this. And as I think James, Canada, we have an interesting dynamic now between Quebec, where there's a real push to kind of establish the laïcité, the secular nature of the state. And then in English-speaking Canada, we're a little bit more fuzzy about it, and I think our immigrant society it challenges us in many ways, but we're still a bit uncertain as to how it all sort of plays out vis-a-vis our fellow citizens in Quebec. And so the question comes specifically about sort of the religious public square. And the question is, what impact do you think a growing Muslim and Sikh population in Canada and the UK are having on the religious sort of public square? So, for example, there's now a move in Quebec with a law that would ban public prayer, which has been brought on and instigated by protest, what we might call protest prayer, that's quite intimidating by some Muslims in front of one of the oldest churches in Montreal, Notre Dame Basilica. how do we, in a pluralist sense, how do we occupy that public square together as people of different religious traditions that are often very, very different?
Mm. Yes, I mean, there's a tendency for the secular mind to treat religion, first of all, to construct religion as simply the antonym to secularity. And you've got secularism on the one hand, and then you've got kind of the religion category on the other. And what that does within the secular mind is it encourages this idea that, everything in the religion box is basically the same sort of thing. These belief systems are basically the same, and these people, they do roughly similar things that are not the things that we do. And so there's a kind of tone deafness when it comes, for example, to understanding the radically different political theologies of, say, Augustinian Christianity from, say, Salafi Islam, or indeed any kind of Islam. I mean, Islam, in many ways, and I've said this before, has a much more coherent political theology, or much more, let's say, predictable and plausible political theology, given its monotheistic assumptions, than Christianity. Christianity's invention of the secular, that is to say, not a completely neutral or agnostic space, but a space in which the earthly powers can, as it were, exercise a kind of limited dominion within God's overarching creative dominion. That is a very surprising development in the history of monotheistic thought. If God's in charge, if there's one God who's the creator of everything distinct from himself, where else would authority come from? And so Islam has, in some ways, in refusing any distinction between the secular and the sacred, is much more consistent. And yet we have to accept that in a society with increasingly many Muslims, where we want to honor and we don't want to tell Muslims to stop being Muslim, then we're going to have increasingly many people who will just refuse to see anything wrong with praying publicly before another church, who will simply see the world not as divided between a secular public square and a kind of sacred, eternal ecclesial space, but simply in the only distinction that Islam recognizes. That is to say, the distinction between Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam, the world of conflict, maybe inner tension and inner conflict, that sense of conflict, inner and outer, that emerges from the refusal to submit to Allah, and the world that has resolved those tensions internally and externally by submitting to Allah. And that's simply what Islam is. You may like it, you may not like it, but it's not, it is not a belief system that is compatible with a kind of post-Christian, secularized Augustinian distinction between the sacred and the secular.
So that is, I think, obviously going to that conflict, or that maybe inability to exist side by side on that profoundly deep philosophical and theological plane, is going to continue to pose challenges in the public square, I think is what you're saying. So it begs another question that someone has raised, and that is there a place for, they use the term Christian enclaves, but rather for Christians to have control over their own institutions within a wider sort of maybe anti-Christian culture, we might say a wider pluralist culture where there are these tensions. So this is probably, building a little bit upon the Benedict option argument, should Christians be innovating in various ways to establish new institutions, not just for the church, but for the broader society? So is that possible, do you think, given where we are right now with 21st century Western pluralism?
Yes, I certainly think it is possible, because I see it. Indeed, I live it here in Cambridge. My wife and I bought a rather eccentric house on the river with a very large garden, and I don't quite know how we managed it, but she managed it. And we've built a whole load of sheds and huts and shepherds' huts and chalets, and we have a chapel. We had a shipping container that we've turned into a chapel, and we have a kind of quasi-monastic Benedict option style community of maybe, I don't know, anything between 10 to 15 students during term time, and various visiting scholars and speakers. And we try to kind of cultivate something like that. And I think you're right. Maybe the great challenge before us is to sort of reverse engineer the 4th century. That is to say, to work out how to go from Constantine back into the catacombs, not as a kind of strategy of retreat and withdrawal. And I know one of the things that Rod was upset about by the reception of his book, that it was interpreted as a sort of manifesto for a kind of withdrawal, retreating to the hills.
Throw up the walls, ghettoize.
Throw up the walls and vanish. Now, to be fair to his critics, and I told him this over dinner in Rome a couple of weeks ago, if he'd chosen the metaphor of the catacombs rather than the metaphor of Monte Cassino, he might have not invited those criticisms. And I think the catacomb is the better metaphor, because I was in Rome a couple of weekends ago and I visited the catacombs, and they are in the city, but not of the city. And Christians in the catacombs, they would go back and forth. Of course, it was primarily a place where they would venerate the dead and conduct services, but also the Eucharist. They would meet. They would also be a place where they could provide welfare for each other and provide, sort of rather dark and gloomy, but some kind of sense of solidarity and community in an extremely hostile world at the turn of the 3rd to 4th century, where that last great wave of persecutions, where they were able to hide and practice communion, practice that sense of togetherness. And from those awful persecutions in the catacombs, 301, 302, 303 to 312, and the Edict of Milan and Constantine's victory, is barely 10 years. And so, whereas I think Monte Cassino really was an attempt, that was importantly, it was a withdrawal from the corruption and decadence of Rome for Benedict and that sort of But though all those kinds of community, I think we probably need both. We probably do need those who are actually making a retreat to the hills and forging communities of prayer and of dedication to preserving the glory, the civilizational fruits and glories of the present age for future ages. But also, I think we need those who are in the catacombs, commuting into the Senate, commuting to the Forum, getting engaged and active in politics and seeking change. And I'm actually encouraged. I know he's not everybody's most popular politician here in Britain, but I mean, I've spent quite a bit of time with Nigel Farage in recent weeks and months, and he keeps coming back to this line that we are a Judeo-Christian nation. I don't like that compound adjective myself, and I've told him that, but he has this instinct for it. He says, I'm not a perfect Christian, I'm not a perfect churchgoer, but I recognize that this is deep in the bones of this nation, and that if we want to recover it and celebrate it and cherish it, we have to somehow accommodate that. We have to somehow be able to make sense of that. And that, I should say, is in sharp contrast to our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, the first self-declared atheist in the history of this country as Prime Minister to occupy 10 Downing Street. And it's true, I'm sorry to say, of the leader of His Majesty's opposition, Kemi Badenoch, who is the first self-declared atheist leader of the Conservative Party. This is unprecedented. The last year we've had, as it were, leader of both our main parties, Downing Street, and leader of the opposition, self-declared atheists, and this rather sort of discomforting populist figure in Nigel Farage is the only one who's willing to say, actually, I may not be a model Christian, but I do recognize that it's important, and I'm serious about it, and it's important that we recruit Christians to the party and to Parliament and to public life.
You were sort of reflecting on the beauties of Cambridge and the beauties of the various colleges and the chapels and so forth. And I've spent lots of time thinking, basically a fan of St. John's College Choir and St. John's College Chapel, but there's so many wonderful places in Cambridge and Oxford throughout the country where you can find, especially as a faithful Christian, that time of prayer, wonderful beauty and goodness and so forth. But again, it has to be broader than that. It has to be present throughout the whole country. So how is it, this is another, maybe a last question, how can we as Christians in particular represent the sacred to people, knowing that deep down within themselves, there's a yearning for that, just as how we're hardwired. So what are ways in which in this kind of odd pluralism that we find ourselves in now, we can sort of reanimate the sacred, represent the sacred to people through the very rich traditions that we have that are so visibly present in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in the United States, that people often want to learn more about?
Mm. Well, it's a very good question. I mean, I have noticed among my younger students, many of them are drawn to the more sort of evangelical, expressive, Wesleyan forms of Christianity. And they're still doing very, very well. And I would say they, do they have a sense of the sacred? Well, I think they do. They have a deep sense of communion with God through prayer and through fellowship, through scripture, particularly. It's probably not the sort of fascination with the sort of liturgical universe and the sacramentality of the created order. But I do see that emerging too. I see a sort of deep sort of a love of tradition, a love of the sacred among young people. And I don't actually know the answer to that question. How does one represent it? I mean, I'm not a priest. I don't feel I'm very gifted at it. I'm good at sort of talking about it, but I'm not very good at sort of presenting it. I mean, here at our community, we do have morning prayer Mondays and Fridays, and sometimes on Wednesdays as well. And we sometimes will do Compline, and we always make sure we have a sung grace at the beginning of every meal. We use these lovely old Scottish graces. So we try and sort of punctuate the mundane with flashes of transcendence and gratitude to God. And we try and sort of, we try to anchor ourselves in that. I think music is, choral music, choral evensong is something that I always encourage students to connect to go to. Compline is a lovely service. It's sort of often done in colleges at sort of 9-10 in the evening, and there's always sort of a hot chocolate or a glass of port at the end of it, and a bit of solid, a bit of community too. But it's very, very difficult. And, particularly in the world of, Oxford, Cambridge and London, it's just very, very fast paced. It's extremely competitive, all very, very kind of bright people. And finding that solace is difficult. And I certainly struggle with it. And it's something that I think I should be learning more about from you.
Well, we need to have more conversations, James. That's the bottom line. And as our former Cardus colleague James K. A. Smith would always talk about, the cracks in the secular. And may those cracks grow ever wider, and may that light, continue to shine through.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, James, for this time together. I hope we can do it more often. And I'm glad you're now fully introduced to Cardus, and this has been a wonderful time together and conversation. I thank all of the people that have been following the webinar and asking such wonderful questions, especially all of you Taylorites that are out there. We are having another webinar that'll be coming up shortly. I have to read my notes here that I've been given on October 23rd. And my colleague, Joanna van Hoff, will be hosting Jim Farney, and they'll be discussing the politics of religious schools in Canada. So probably nicely building off this conversation. James, thank you again very much. I hope we see each other soon in some part of the world, preferably in England. I need to get over there fairly soon. God bless you. God bless you and all of your work.
Thank you so much to you and to Cardus for having me, and we want you to come back over soon, and we'd love to welcome you back to Cambridge. So please do that.
Thank you, James. Please God. Talk to you soon. God bless you.
God bless you all. Bye bye.
Thank you.